Prepare.
You can sit down, guys. So we knew Ellen was really uncomfortable with all the dark tones in the room, and I didn't think it was fair that we could come out and actually talk about security in all black.
Yeah.
So as everyone, for anyone who wasn't in the room before, I'm Maureen Cushing. I'm one of the co-founders of TechTable, and I am here with some really knowledgeable colleagues on the security front. So we're going to do some deep diving in everything security that relates to hospitality. So Phil is from Reliant, Dan is from Coalfire, and Gareth is from the PCI Council. So Phil was part of TechTable last year, and we were a mere 21 days from the EMV liability shift. So I'd love to have you give us a recap of where we're at, 1 year later, what you're seeing with adoption, consumer behavior.
Absolutely. So, I work in both traditional retail, hospitality, and convenience stores. So those markets are very different. It's easy. In traditional retail, there's a cash wrap, the concept of card present, an exchange of goods, folding of merchandise, whether it's footwear, whatever it is. Hospitality brings a whole nother dimension. And for our hospitality merchants, what we're seeing is, especially in the franchisee environment, where the strategic direction is based on the EMV chargeback liability shift, we are seeing a trend at that end of the market. But I think what's really interesting about payment integration and strategy in general is that if you look at the upper tier of the market, the POS vendors that really dominate the space in hospitality have very different approaches as it relates to payment integration. And some of them have kind of provided a clear pathway, and some of them have not. And I think that's one of the major reasons that we're here today is there's a lack of direction and a lack of a bundled, well-defined package to deploy into hospitality, and the lack of that has kind of created the insurgence of other very nimble, flexible, agile companies to adopt payments. So in hospitality, I think what we're seeing, and I think you guys would agree as the merchant community, that protecting the data, right, has business justifiable grounds, whereas the investment for EMV, physical hardware, wiring infrastructure, skills that maybe you don't have as a hospitality merchant is a much tougher pill to swallow. I think that's it.
Absolutely. I think I touched on it earlier, but the challenge is making it feel seamless to the guest.
Yep.
And now Gareth is from the UK, and so obviously they adopted EMV a long time ago, over 10 years ago. So what have you seen with the fraud shifts? Have you seen a shift in fraud in the UK and other European countries?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting. We've had chip cards, as Maureen mentioned, for close to a decade now. They've been available. Everybody's cards in the UK have had them for a long time. EMV terminals in all merchant stores. And as merchants have started to roll out EMV, what we've noticed is a huge drop in card present fraud. EMV is fantastic at card present fraud and mitigating that. It stops people from being able to copy cards. It's not perfect in that it doesn't protect against card not present fraud, but for card present fraud, it's fantastic. What we've seen is somewhere in the region of about 95% drop in fraud. Of course, criminals don't just give up at that point, so they don't go away. They move. What are the next lowest hanging fruits? So what we've seen in the UK, in Europe, is a really big shift towards card not present fraud. There are certain technologies that have been out in the UK and in Europe for a while now, such as 3D Secure. I've seen that's coming more and more over here now, and we're just working at the moment on version 2 of that standard. And one other area that's really interesting that I just want to touch on quickly is legislation. In the UK and in the rest of Europe, we've got quite strong privacy laws. We've got laws around data protection in particular, and cardholder data, credit card data, is considered to be personally identifiable information. And there are laws around that. And in particular, there are some new laws coming through at the moment, coming from Europe, that are really pushing fines and so on, and liability for breaches that include PII. So that's a really interesting thing to see changing at the moment.
Now, do you see that? Do you have any kind of prediction for when we could possibly see that legislation in the United States? And I think that, just to make sure everyone really understands, is that means that there's government fines where, Target, Home Depot, they just get a slap on the wrist and move on their way.
I'll say two things quickly there. The FTC when they've talked about the work that we do at the PCI Council, they've actually said that PCI is one really good example of self-regulation. So from that perspective, it sounds very promising that they're not going to get too involved in it. But at the same time, certainly on the PII side of it, we've seen breach notification laws over here. And we've then borrowed those over in Europe. The new laws have those in there. But then I think, as to whether those laws will come over here, particularly with things like fines, I think a lot of that will be dependent on what happens in the election later this year.
We won't go there.
Let's not.
Dan, so you're from Coalfire. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the hospitality and other verticals for what people are doing for merchant security?
Yeah, so Coalfire helps all different kinds of industries with their security aspects. And in this space, EMV, encryption, there isn't one right answer. There isn't one solution you need to be looking at. You have to understand, you have to understand your business and what your risks are so that you can make those wise decisions. So when it comes to the payment space, payments and security isn't typically what you're focused on. So you want to be able to leverage the technologies out there. And one of the things, as Phil was saying, is there's a lot of different things to look at and a lot of different choices. So being able to pick the right one that fits your business needs so that you can make those good business decisions is really one of the most critical things that you can do as you move forward in increasing your business, but still managing what risk am I at from security, from breaches, and the things that we've seen in the last few years.
Great. So, Phil, I think historically we see that the biggest margin of error in the hospitality industry is just a lot of the vendors that hospitality companies are using standard passwords and a lot of human error. What are you seeing as far as what the industry is doing to get around that and protect their data?
So, I think there's common errors and pretty consistent. If you look at the major breaches in the last 12 to 16 months, there's some pretty common denominators in terms of risk factors and technical approaches that were problematic. And what we see is service providers that sell to you. So if you're a small merchant, a small hospitality merchant, chances are you don't have a direct relationship with your POS vendor. You are working through a reseller. And those resellers, and I'm not here to bash the resellers, but they're in a revenue business and it's in their best interest to deploy as many sites as possible. And sometimes the people deploying those sites are not security focused. So the applications that you use as a merchant do not, by their very nature, make you PCI compliant, right? And the validation of how those applications are deployed is very important. And what we tend to see is that things like remote access. So in security in general, not PCI, but just in general data cybersecurity, that's a concept of AAA, which is authentication, authorization, and auditing, right? And accounting, which is really the ability to really restrict and control access to systems to the specific people that should have access to them at the right levels. And what we see is service providers deploying massive amounts of software as a cookie cutter approach and making mistakes. And that is a common factor that we've seen across the industry. And there's some programs out there to counteract that. So that's certainly what we see.
Well, I hope we're finally moving away from the practice of, let me just install this little widget on your POS that's caused so many problems. So Gareth, it's a pretty exciting, so Gareth, as I said, is from the PCI Council, so pretty exciting year for them. It's their 10-year anniversary, and he's the director of training, and you've had about 36,000 seats of training over the last 10 years. So can you tell us a little bit more about the roadmap for PCI and where you see it going?
Okay. So, we've been very, very busy over the last 10 years. We've grown from managing one standard, PCI DSS, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, to now managing, depending on how you count it, around 8 or 9 different standards. So it really has grown significantly in terms of just the reach that we have. One interesting thing that people don't always realize is that the PCI Council is 32 people in total. So we're very, very small.
They sound so much more powerful.
Yeah, we're 32 people, that's it. So our reach is is huge. But sometimes, when we get comments, what can you do? Why aren't you doing certain things in this area and so on? Some of that is simply down to our size. Some of it also is we have to really be very careful in terms of exactly what we're doing. We can be reactive when we see breaches happening. So to Phil's comment about, for example, seeing some of the issues that are out there, defaults being set, bad passwords, unpatched systems, just adding a little feature here or there. We're able to react to that when we're seeing large issues. So, for example, the QIR program is something that is fairly recent. We actually launched that in 2012, and I think, Phil, you were part of the second tranche of companies, second company.
I'm the second PCI
company.
QIR globally.
Right.
Do you want to tell everyone what a QIR is?
Sure. So what evolved out of PCI is that the PCI standard is really a framework for how to deploy and the technical security controls to deploy within a merchant environment. PCI QIR is very focused on payment systems implementation. And it's specifically focused on the applications that store, process, and transmit cardholder data. So in 2012, when the Standards Council, when Gareth and the team came up with the standard, my company looked at it strategically that this, on the kind of heels of EMV and what was coming with mobility and omni-channel, cross-channel selling, click and collect, order online, pick up in restaurant type of integrations, was going to be strategically the framework that kind of provided guidance as to how these new systems, which were all going to be brand new, were going to be implemented. And there's a set of prescriptive controls around QIR in terms of working with a merchant, working with a hospitality merchant, and how the systems are defined in the lab environments, how they're tested, how they are documented, how evidentiary data, how do I prove that the system that I had in the lab, that it was working correctly, that I deploy out to one site, 25 sites, 50 restaurants? How do I prove that the integrity and the controls in place are working the same way? And that's what QIR does. It creates a framework. It's not an audit of the hospitality merchant. It's really ensuring that the payment systems are deployed in a PCI compliant manner.
And just to add to that as well, I was at our community meeting just last week, and I was chatting to one of our PCI forensic investigator companies from Verizon. And some of you may be aware of Verizon. They have a data breach investigation report, and they also do a PCI report every year. You can download it from their website. And their PCI report is due to come out in just the next couple of weeks. So I was really interested just to hear what sorts of issues there are, and in particular how that affects hospitality. So a couple of quick facts about it. Hospitality right now currently is pretty much joint last in terms of security from what they're seeing in terms of breaches. You're alongside financial services, believe it or not. And in terms of exactly where the issues are, Phil touched on this earlier, we have issues in terms of patching and making sure that systems are being kept up to date. I think 100% of all of the breaches that they saw had antivirus installed. Fantastic. But antivirus is only one part of the solution. Patching, keeping systems up to date, making sure that default passwords aren't enabled, having things open to the public that don't need to be. Those were all the big issues. So if you can basically patch your systems, keep them up to date, change passwords, QIRs can help you with this. That goes a long way to helping with security.
So Dan, Coalfire is a QASC. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the forensics data and how people are getting in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you had a breach, you might call Dan's company.
That's right. So we see a lot of different breaches across a lot of different merchants, and so QSA, that's the program that Gareth and PCI run. So we're a QSA company. Phil is a QIR company. We're also a PA, so a payment application. So all the applications that you use to do PCI, we also look at those. So we have a unique perspective because we have merchants using different systems, and then we also look at the applications, and then we also see those breaches. And the QIR program has kind of been something that was that gap that was missing in terms of everyone following kind of that same PCI playbook as a baseline of what's a minimum decent place to start for a security approach. When it comes down to actual breaches and what we've seen, and on the forensic side, it ties very closely to what they both said. Ultimately, there's a human element involved, and what else do you all have in your companies but lots of people, right? So educating them and helping them understand those things. Beyond the human element, the root area that we typically see is to how someone ultimately gets in, tied to humans and whatever people are doing, does tend to be where the systems are implemented, integrated, or maintained. So either at implementation of your system or as you go and you maintain it, something was missed, typically by a person. But ultimately, that's where they come in. It could be remote access, which is really one of the most common ways. So remoting into your system from outside of the core network. And then, so for example, with that, if the access control, so who's supposed to be allowed in, is not properly maintained, if you open it up for some reason and then you never close it, you've left a permanent security hole, and that's often how people get in. And the rest of it, what you hear in the news, around the different breaches, the software that pulls out of memory, all the cardholder data and spits it out. There's a bunch of failure points in there. Like AV could have been one of them that might have caught it. With Target, it didn't, right? And so there's a whole chain of events, a bunch of different things that it could be.
Great. So once again, we're running out of time. So two of the last questions that I'd love to touch on so that the audience has some takeaways is if someone could talk about the difference between 3.1 and 3.2 and how it affects this community. And then, what are the questions that companies should be asking vendors and different software companies? What questions should they be asking when they're trying to use a new tool to prevent breach? Go for it.
Sure. So we've talked about the controls, but I think it's really important. I want to go back to something in the beginning, which is, the concept of devaluing data and cardholder data. And the real value here, and my company, I'm a strong proponent of turning, payment card data into ciphertext, right? And using technologies like point-to-point encryption. So that's it's an easy thing to say. We're going to encrypt the data and we're going to make that data invisible. So if the hackers get in and they get a hold of it, they can't repurpose it. And if I steal it, it's got zero value to that organization. The challenge is it's an extremely strategic process to get through that conversation. The selection of a device, which is required for a validated versus non-validated solution, and we can talk about that after. I don't want to take up too much time. But the concept of point-to-point encryption really relies on either acquirer or third-party service provider, which has gone through validation steps to provide encryption keys, which are injected into these devices, thereby rendering that data useless. And the strategic decision that you guys have to make is, which vendor do I go with? Because all of these other POS vendors, and a lot of what we've heard today is about building for these businesses a recurring revenue model. And it's very important for them because they can get you guys for a license, for a POS application or a back of house license for one-time use. But if they can get your payments information and add an incremental value for encrypting that data, that is worth something, right? And there's a recurring revenue stream for them. And that is a big win for those companies because they can bring in marketing, they can bring in other services into the hospitality environment. And I think that is a very strategic discussion to have and understand who owns that data, how it's being processed, where my exposure is as a merchant, both in my in-restaurant systems and into the cloud or my data center or third-party service providers based on where my merchant ID may reside.
And Maureen, you mentioned 3.1 to 3.2. There's a whole bunch of different things there. A lot of it's actually for the service providers, and some of it doesn't even happen right away. So if I had to pick one to mention, I think you talked about this last year. I wasn't at TechTable last year, but I think you heard a little bit about two-factor authentication. So that's where your user ID and password would be a factor, and then your thumbprint or something would be another factor, or something that you have, like your phone or a token. Those are the three types of factors. So PCI has renamed it to multi-factor. That has no bearing on what you have to do. However, what does have bearing, and it is down the road, is that you need to be using it for your remote access. So multi-factor for all remote access, for admin access. But ultimately, from a security perspective, this is where we draw the compliance line and the security line. We would recommend that you do implement that or look at understanding how the solutions that you have can let you utilize multi-factor or two-factor authentication to get in. And that is one of the best ways that could have potentially stopped a lot of these other breaches if because it was just a single credential that got compromised. So when you add another factor, then it would have been stopped.
I think as well, the key thing I would just say quickly is when you're looking for vendors, talking to vendors. There are no silver bullets out there. That's the first thing I would say. If a vendor is saying you don't need to worry about PCI compliance, that simply isn't true. At the end of the day, it's always going to be your responsibility. So if you get breached, you're the ones that are going to get fines and so on from your acquirers. Look at the contracts that you have with your vendors. Understand what would happen if there were an issue. What's the liability to them? If they make a mistake, what does that mean? Using a QIR is a great way to make sure that an application is installed correctly. They can look after the maintenance as well. And also just make sure that you understand some of the compliance programs and some of the rule changes that are coming very shortly as well. I know Visa has a mandate that's out now and is becoming effective at the beginning of next year. And I think they actually published some more documentation around that just in the last couple of weeks. So make sure you understand what that means to you as a business as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. They will be at the cocktail hour if anyone has any questions. I know we didn't.
Without apron.
Wearing aprons now.
No apron. Well, they will. They might be serving oysters, or
Maybe.
they might not. Thank you.